glad to put our heart to the task again here. If you haven't yet opened your Bible, I want you to turn to James, the 3rd chapter, please. As Josh just read for us, we're going to look at that this morning. In general, now I want to just make a couple of observations and applications that I think are important for us. James is a very practical book. If you're having trouble in your life, living life the way you ought to read James. I'm not so sure that we ought to read James every week. Just take it out, read the letter, read everything that says in it and say, am I applying that to my life? So if you're having difficulty, just read James. And I think that'll answer a lot of questions for you if you're willing to apply that. But the passage that Josh read for us, beginning in verse 13, is a passage about heavenly wisdom and earthly wisdom. But it gets practical, okay? It's not just, let's talk about heaven's wisdom and earth's wisdom and the difference in those things. There's a very practical aspect to that too, because in verse 13, the text says, who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show by good conduct that his works are done in the meekness of wisdom. This is not just talking about wisdom. It's talking about living like a person who is listening to God. That's what he's saying. He said, practical wisdom says you listen to what God says. Verses 14 through 16 say that the wisdom that is earthly uses three definitions. The wisdom that is earthly, sensual, and demonic is not from above. It comes from Satan. It comes from a place that we don't want to be. He says in verse 14, but if you have bitter envy and self-seeking in your hearts, do not boast and lie against the truth. This wisdom does not descend from above, but it's earthly, sensual, and demonic. And for where envy and self-seeking exist, confusion and every evil thing are there. I don't want us to have that wisdom. I want us to have the wisdom that comes from above. And there is a 7-fold description in verse 17 that tells us what the wisdom from above looks like. I'm going to focus on one of those this morning, but I want to read them all to you. But the wisdom that is from above is first pure. It's peaceable. It's gentle. It's willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy. We could talk about, and maybe at another time we'll talk about all of those descriptions of what wisdom from above looks like. But I want to talk to you about one this morning. The one that I want to talk to you about in my translation that I'm using, which is the New King James, it says it's willing to yield. In the King James Version, it says it's easy to be entreated. That kind of wisdom is easily to be entreated. And the English Standard Version, which is the version that I want to focus on this morning, I want to use this translation, I want to use this phraseology. It says it's open to reason. Open to reason. Do you have somebody you can't get along with? Do you have some bodies you can't get along with? How about this question? Do you have a spouse that you can't get along with? You have a coworker that you can't get along with? Do you have a fellow member of the church that you can't get along with? Are there people that in your day-to-day activities you find hard to get along with? And part of why you find it hard to get along with them is because they're unwilling to yield. They're not easily entreated. They are hard. They are not open to reason. I referred to this essay that C.S. Lewis did. I referred to it a few weeks ago. It's called God in the Dock. But in the God in the Dock essays, there's a particular essay called The Trouble with X, in which C.S. Lewis says, do you have a friend in quotes, do you have a friend that you cannot reason with? They just completely are stubborn and they're closed-minded. And he talks about that, and in that he talks about the fact that if somebody is unwilling to listen, if somebody is unwilling to hear another side or another point of view, just a complete unwillingness to do that, how that destroys a relationship. And all of us understand that. I have my thoughts. But it's pretty clear that if I want to share my thoughts, I need to be willing for you to share your thoughts with me. And some people are just too close-minded and stubborn to do that. And part of wisdom that is from above says that not just that it's pure and peaceable, but that it's willing to yield. Some people, my friends, are just hard. Some people are just hard. And it's hard, and sometimes with those people, it's hard to have a relationship. And for the reason, part of the reason is because they are just unwilling to yield. And they're not open-minded enough to even listen to what someone would have to say. I want to share with you this morning for just a minute. I want to share one of those people with you. I want you to turn to 1 Samuel 25, if you would. This is a story about David and another couple named Nabal and Abigail. Nabal is a rich man. He's got 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats and evidently a whole lot of other animals. And the text tells us that his wife Abigail she's good in understanding. It also adds that she has a beautiful appearance. So she's pretty and she's smart. And she's married to a rich man. And when Nabal's servants and his men are out shearing the sheep, they're evidently in the wilderness, and David's men apparently help them. They protect them, and they don't take anything away from them. They treat them just as well as they could. And as a result, David sends 10 of his men to Nabal with a request. Would you feed us? Would you help us? Would you give us supplies? Verse 9 says, and so when David's young men came, they spoke to Nabal according to all of these words in the name of David. And then it says, and they waited. I think that's interesting. And they waited. They waited because Nabal had to respond. When David made the request, when David's men made the request to feed us and to give us supplies, they made that to Nabal, and it says, then they waited. Verse 10, then Nabal answered David's servants and said, who is David and who is the son of Jesse? There are many servants nowadays who break away each one from his master. Shall I then take my bread and my water and my meat that I have killed for my shearers and give it to men when I do not know where they're from? Verse 12 says, so David's young men turned on their heels and went back. It's almost like, let's get out of here. He's not going to listen to us. He's not listening to a thing we've said. He's not going to help us, so let's get out of here. So they turned on their heels and went back, and they came and told him all these words. And then David said to his men, basically, here's the gist. Get on your sword. We're going to go find him. And while this is going on, one of the young men of Nabal goes back and tells Abigail, who's Nabal's wife, listen, David's coming to kill Nabal and to kill us because we didn't help them. And the young man who is Nabal's servant said to Abigail, who is Nabal's wife, we should have done what they wanted. They were good to us. They helped us. When Abigail heard that, the text says she made haste. She gathered up all sorts of things. It's interesting. Verse 18 says she took 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 sheep already dressed, 5 seahs of roasted grain, 100 clusters of raisins, 200 cates of figs, and loaded them on donkeys. In other words, if they're not going to come for the feast is going to them. And she takes this food and she meets David. She said, my husband made a mistake. And I want to try to make up for it. I do not want to be killed, and I don't want him to be killed. Verse 23, now when Abigail saw David, she dismounted quickly from the donkey, fell on her face before David, and bowed down to the ground. So she fell at his feet and said, on me, my Lord, on me let this iniquity be. And please let your maidservants speak in your ears and hear the words of your maidservants. And so she told him what had happened. She goes back home. Nabal's drunk, evidently terribly drunk. She doesn't tell him what happens till the next morning when he's over his drunkenness a little bit. Verse 36 says, she went to Nabal, who was holding a feast. His heart was merry, for he was drunk. But in the morning, verse 37, when the wine had gone from Nabal and his wife had told him all these things, then his heart died within him, and he became like a stone. Then it happened after about 10 days that the Lord struck Nabal, and he died. I don't know everything about the story, but just what we've read. Evidently, Nabal's heart was horrible. Verse 39, so when David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, blessed be the Lord who has pleaded the cause of my reproach from the hand of Nabal and has kept his servant from evil. For the Lord has returned the wickedness of Nabal on his head. And David sent and proposed to Abigail to take her as his wife. I mean, this is full circle, right? This is full circle. What's the lesson? What's the lesson of Nabal? I think there are a lot of lessons we can learn, but what do you think the essential lesson of Nabal is? Here's what I think it is. Don't be unreasonable. Be willing to listen. When David's men came to him, evidently he didn't even reason at all. And God struck him dead because of it. It stunned him initially, and 10 days after that he died. And the text says that God created that. God caused that. Because he had not done justly what he should have done. So the lesson is, don't be like Nabal. What was Nabal? He was closed-minded. He had wisdom that was earthly. He had wisdom that was sensual. He had wisdom that was demonic. He had wisdom that was all about himself. He didn't want to hear from anybody else. People who are like that don't have many friends. People who are unwilling to listen. People who are unwilling to allow people to talk to them. People who C.S. Lewis calls, this person is like X. He's unwilling to yield. And people like that have the wisdom that James calls earthly, sensual, and demonic. And I would say this about all of that good relationships demand give and take. You know, there are times when I think I know quite a bit. And then it quickly passes. And I realize that I don't. And sometimes that idea makes me feel a little bit too self-sufficient. We're not talking about conviction here. I've reached conviction about certain things that have to do with what I want, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. But I want to say this. Listen carefully. None of us are self-sufficient. None of us. I don't care how smart you think you are. I don't care how knowledgeable you think you are. I don't care how self-sufficient you think you are. All of us need each other. Because only God has this perfect wisdom. And I think that's what James is saying. That wisdom that God has is the wisdom that comes from above. And it demonstrates itself in all these things. So we should cultivate a willingness to hear. I don't like relationships that I have with people who are unwilling to listen to what I have to say. They don't have to accept what I have to say, but please be willing to hear. And there may be some who feel the same toward me. You know, it's hard in relationships because a lot of times we think we're right about most everything. Right? We landed yesterday in Nashville. And I told Beth, I said, you go get the luggage. How's that for being a good husband? You go get the luggage and I'll go get the car. And when you get all the luggage, you call me and I'll come pick you up. But you know, when it's chaos trying to get into the airport, and when it's chaos trying to get luggage, she was trying to carry and pull 4 pieces of luggage by herself. She had all sorts of people wanting to help her, I think. But to get it where she needed to get it, and then explain to me where she had gotten so that I could pick up. You can just imagine, I'm just telling you all this, you can imagine all this work. Some of you have been through it, right? Fortunately, 3.5 hours later, no, it wasn't that long. Fortunately, I connected with her pretty quickly, but it was just, you know, when we finally got in the car, we kind of looked at each other like, we got that done. And it was kind of like, I was kind of like, well, you didn't quite listen to me. And it was kind of like, well, you didn't quite listen to me. And so that's why I thought, well, and both of us kind of looked at each other like, I'm really glad we got this together. We got all our luggage and we're heading toward home. But I'm telling you, you know, even in that scenario, there was a little bit of, Kenny thinks he knows what's best. Beth thinks she knows what's best. I can't even look at her because she's got that little smirk. I can see it right now. I'm just going to talk to this side. From here, I'm talking from here up. I'm not going to talk to y'all. But it's hard because we think we know what's best, right? And we need to hear. I think what open to reason is we need to be willing to look at every side. Just think about in a relationship when you're open and when you're willing to listen. Think about how much better that is. Think about a marriage where a husband and wife are willing to be fair and honest with each other. One thing that got me thinking about these ideas was Ephesians 4. Last week I taught from the book of Ephesians. Ephesians 4:30 maybe. Let no corrupt speech come out of your mouth. Let no unwholesome word come out of your mouth. Does that not sting a little bit to all of us? Let not one word that's unwholesome come out of your mouth. How important speech is and how important a willingness to get along is. Wouldn't that go a long way toward helping all relationships, whether it's husband and wife or children, parent, or employee? Wouldn't it go a long way if everybody just was willing to listen and really thought about every word that they said? How much trouble do we get in because we just pop off and we're unwilling to listen? We act like Nabal. I'm not going to listen to that. And God doesn't like that. He doesn't want that. That's wisdom from below. It's not wisdom from above. He wants us to have this wisdom, this heavenly wisdom. We should cultivate this willingness to hear every side and be reasonable. And that's not, he wants us to be doctrinally stable. Here's where some difficulty comes in for us. I think there are some things that we need to strongly believe and have conviction about. And I know you do too. Don't waver on those things. Have some conviction about that. In Ephesians 4:14, you know, that's where Paul says, don't be carried away by every wind of doctrine. In order for that not to happen, you have got to study. You've got to form some conviction. But the best way to do that is have wisdom that is from above, that's willing to reason and think about what it is that you and I need to think about. And that's what God wants. God wants conviction with reason. I've done a lot of thinking about that in the past several years. Sometimes I'm going to share more of that with you. But I would just summarize that by saying I think what the Bible teaches is that He wants conviction. But He wants that conviction to come with reason. And the principle that I am open to that I'm willing to yield, that I'm willing to think about, the wisdom that comes with that helps build these kind of relationships. Now you can just make that in every situation. So ask yourself, are you a little bit, is there something about you that's unwilling? Are you a little bit like X that C.S. Lewis talked about? Is there something about you that's unwilling to yield? You know, when I ask myself that question, the answer is yes. Yes. There are times in my life when I've been unwilling to yield, that I have been unopen to reason, that I've not been a person who's easily entreated. I know people like that. I know people that are almost unapproachable. I don't like being around them. I don't like it. They may be right, but I don't like their attitude. I don't like the fact that they're unapproachable. I don't like that at all. And that's not the spirit. That's not the wisdom that comes from above. People who act like that are not treating people with the wisdom that comes from above. So we have to be people who do that. And when we're a person who does that, then we'll be swift to hear. We're swift to hear, but we're slow to speak. And so like Abigail, who understood what Nabal should have understood, we need to be people who have good understanding about this wisdom that comes from above. The lesson today is really just to allow us to think about this wisdom that James talks about and ask ourselves if we are people of peace, if we are people who are willing to reason. And I would certainly hope that we are. So this morning I would just ask you, if you are in this audience, you know, preaching is, and teaching, it's about persuading, and ultimately about persuading. It's not just hearing something, but it's helping persuade people to do what they need to do. And I can't force that. All I can do is teach and ask you to be easily persuaded because you're willing to reason. That's what we're talking about this morning. If your heart is hard, if it's not pliable, if it's unwilling to yield, you're not going to respond in a positive way to the Lord's invitation, whether you need to in a public way or not. You're not going to react positively to it because you're just stubborn. Don't be stubborn. There were some in Acts 2 who were stubborn, and they didn't respond. And there were some in Acts 2 who weren't stubborn, who listened and who reasoned and who responded in the way that God wanted. I would encourage you this morning to do that, as Mitch leads us in this invitation.